It's 2023, and the Wagner Group has just thrown Russia into turmoil with their shocking rebellion. Before their dramatic uprising, these mercenaries were Russia's secret weapon in Ukraine, filling the gaps with ex-convicts sent straight into the fire. But this wasn't their first impossible mission. 4 years earlier, in the heart of Syria, Wagner forces clashed with American special operators in a confrontation that Moscow would rather forget. In this video, we'll dive into the explosive encounter at the Battle of Khasham, reveal the high-stakes strategies, and uncover how American military might turned the tide in mere minutes. What secret maneuvers did the US employ, and what does this battle say about the future of warfare? Stick around as we uncover the thrilling details and the dramatic lessons learned from this pivotal clash. But to truly understand this confrontation, we must plunge into the heart of the Syrian civil war, where global powers collided, tensions ran high, and every decision carried life-altering stakes. Picture this: it's 2011, the Syrian civil war erupts, and soon the United States and Russia find themselves on a collision course, each with its own agenda and strategic interests. Amid this chaos, the seeds of the Battle of Khasham were sown. By 2014, the rise of ISIS as a pseudo-Islamist terror state prompted Washington and Moscow to intervene more directly in the conflict. Both of them attacked ISIS with ground and air forces, but otherwise had much different interests. 2014 was an important year for this story in another way, as it was the origin of the current war in Ukraine. The Wagner Group was founded by Dmitry Utkin and Yevgeny Prigozhin as part of this chaos. Utkin, a former veteran of the GRU Russian intelligence agency, was reportedly an admirer of Adolf Hitler and named the group Wagner because this was the previous radio call sign from Utkin. Prigozhin, who was best known as Putin's chef before the group's foundation, was the financier. His portfolio before his death included many interests, including ties to organized crime and, importantly, the mining sector. The Constitution of the Russian Federation officially makes mercenaries and private military companies illegal and prohibits their use in cooperation with the armed forces. Nevertheless, this is Russia we're talking about, and the rule of law isn't much of a thing in those parts. Despite the ban, Moscow had a history of using these companies as part of the less official aspect of its foreign policy. Using these organizations would give the Kremlin more options to achieve its interests while maintaining plausible deniability. Therefore, international security experts regarded the Wagner Group as a quasi-state entity. After cutting its teeth in Ukraine's Donbass war, Wagner went international, with operations across multiple continents. Its reach even included the United States' geopolitical backyard, as Wagner personnel helped to prop up the regime of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Maduro needs these fighters to operate much of the Chinese military equipment his armed forces use. Wagner also reached deep into Africa, where it took advantage of the light American presence and the drawdown of French troops, particularly in the Sahel region. The group's MO in Africa was to provide services for authoritarian regimes on the continent, such as intelligence, training, and logistics for weapons transfers. Most recently, Wagner arrived in Mali in December 2021 to prop up the junta there, as France dramatically scaled back its counter-terror operations. In return for its assistance to these regimes, Wagner would get access to natural resources within their territories. Before the war in Ukraine, the Wagner Group held gold interests in Sudan and in Libya. Wagner took control of the oil fields and blocked shipments to opposing factions in that country's civil war. Although Wagner did not get any revenue from oil sales there, things were different in Syria. Evropolis, one of Prigozhin's companies, signed a deal with the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad when Russia began to intervene against ISIS in 2016. Under the terms of this agreement, the company would get a 25% portion of revenues from the oil and gas fields that the Syrian government was able to retake from the self-proclaimed ISIS caliphate. This agreement marked the immediate background to the incident that occurred in 2018. American and Russian forces gave each other a wide berth in Syria, except for high-profile incidents that occurred in 2017 and 18 over the use of chemical weapons. The United States avoided attacking the Syrian government directly, instead fighting Assad through the rebels that it trained and equipped. Washington and Moscow took additional steps to ensure they would not come into direct conflict, forming a line of de-escalation on the Euphrates River. There were also specialized hotlines that both sides made sure to keep clear so that they would be able to contact one another on a moment's notice. Under assault from all sides, ISIS was in a hopeless situation, and by 2018, it had essentially been wiped out as a territorial entity. During this time, the race was on. All sides tried to take as much territory from their one and only mutual enemy as possible, a little like the situation in Europe at the end of World War II. Despite this competition, the plan to prevent direct conflict between American and Russian forces held. No plan is foolproof though, and the plan got punched in the face on February 7, 2018, on land about 5 miles east of the Euphrates. There was an oil field nearby, and both sides wanted to take control of it, even though it was on the de facto American side of the Euphrates de-escalation zone. The ensuing fight became known as the Battle of Khasham. On the night of February 7th, 500 fighters, consisting almost entirely of the Wagner Group, but including a few troops from the Syrian government, moved towards one of the country's largest oil and gas fields. These fighters advanced on a base for the Syrian Democratic Forces, a rebel group supported by the US. Around 30 American Marines, Army Rangers, and Green Berets were with them in the area. The Russian and Syrian forces were well armed, being supported by tanks, artillery, and air support on standby at a nearby base. The stage was set at around 8:35 p.m. when some T-72 tanks came within a mile of the refinery that was a key position for the SDF troops and their American allies. No fire was exchanged yet, but one of the American troops there, speaking to the Warhorse, mentioned that he and his comrades had been monitoring the unknown group's movements through drone feeds. Those feeds showed artillery crews rehearsing the loading and firing of their guns, although they never loaded a shell. Other enemy fighters were massed near armored personnel carriers, suggesting that they would move into attack mode at any moment. These exercises let the American troops know that they were dealing with Russians, because Russian doctrine emphasizes exercises right up to the point. Then around 10 p.m., the Americans watched as a column of tanks and other armored vehicles began to move toward the refinery. The American troops moved to the support of their allies. At some point, the Russians began to shell the area. During the first 15 minutes of the engagement, American officials used the hotline to contact their Russian counterparts. The Russians, however, denied any involvement with these fighters. It was a real-time illustration of how Moscow used the Wagner Group as an instrument of policy. At this point, the Americans understood that they were not going to resolve the situation through dialogue. They would need to unleash the full force of their military might, but the situation looked grim. An American unit of fewer than 50 soldiers and Marines, riding about 6 trucks, was now on the opposite side of a firing line consisting of 500 soldiers supported by tanks, APCs, and heavy artillery. The American troops were armed only with small arms and machine guns. Their largest weapons were the 50 caliber machine guns mounted on their trucks. These were not good enough to do the needed damage against the enemy now firing at them. There was another problem, an arguably even worse one. The United States has long relied on air dominance to support its ground operations. The Russians, however, had a surface-to-air missile system in the vicinity that would prevent American air power from being used to its fullest potential. Fortunately for the American troops on the ground, the use of the hotline paid off in one important way. Officials in Washington convinced their Russian counterparts to shut down the SAM system, which allowed aircraft to come to the aid of American forces. The decision to shut the SAM system down gave the game away by revealing that official Russian channels were indeed in contact with the Wagner Group, and that the mercenaries were an expression of policy from Moscow, despite earlier denials. That was of secondary concern at the moment, though. The first concern was turning this battle around, and that was about to happen far more rapidly than Wagner could have ever guessed. Once air support was freely available, the United States began its attack with strikes from a Reaper drone. The drone struck the lead and rear vehicles of the Russian convoy with Hellfire missiles. This strike trapped the vehicles in the middle. Other drone strikes attacked the Russian artillery. These drone strikes took the Russians by surprise and threw them into chaos. The United States also had the support of ground fires. Unfortunately for the Russians, Ukraine was not the first instance where they would be on the wrong side of a HIMARS system. In a preview of things to come years later, the HIMARS blasted the enemy convoy. Tube artillery also got in on the act. The shells and rockets left numerous casualties in their wake, but the worst was still to come for Wagner. 4 Apache attack helicopters then sprung into action. Thanks to their infrared optical systems, they were able to track and hit the Russians from several miles away. Before Wagner was even aware of what was happening, the Apaches used laser-guided Hellfire missiles on enemy tanks, while forcing the infantry back with their 30mm cannons. The 30mm fire proved particularly devastating, and a Russian survivor later reported that the explosive shells left 200 dead or wounded in the first few minutes. "To make it short, we've had our asses kicked," he said. Reportedly, at this point, the Wagner troops had nothing but assault rifles. The tables had completely turned from earlier. Wagner's ordeal wasn't yet over though, because the United States had yet to bring in the best of its firepower. AC-130 gunships circled overhead, creating a kill zone. Their onboard weapons were so accurate that they could engage individual targets and prevent them from escaping. Then B-52 bombers came and unleashed their payloads, completely destroying whatever remained of the convoy. Russian and Syrian survivors tried to take shelter in nearby buildings, but this move wouldn't keep them safe for long. F-15 Eagle and F-22 Raptor fighters were also in the skies, and these made short work of the troops who took cover inside the buildings. Such cover was no obstacle to the bombs they dropped. Reportedly, Russian pilots in the nearby airbase were requesting that they be allowed to take off to support their beleaguered countrymen, but this was not granted. After all, the United States military was attacking the Wagner Group, not their comrades in the regular Russian military. The Su-34 and Su-35 fighters at the base were held back. The presence of Eagles and Raptors might have convinced the commanders at the base that they had made the right decision. All told, Wagner likely suffered between 200 and 300 casualties in the battle. The lone casualty on the opposing side was a wounded fighter with the Syrian Democratic Forces. This fighter would later recover from his injuries. No American vehicles or aircraft suffered damage either. At one point, Wagner's casualties became so great that one of the senior officers within the Russian regular military in the area called his American counterparts and asked for a ceasefire, again revealing that Wagner was in contact with the Russian authorities. Reportedly, the Wagner mercenaries took such heavy fire from American air and artillery assets that many of the dead couldn't even be identified in the aftermath. Almost the entire Wagner convoy was also destroyed. Only one tank and one armored personnel carrier remained standing by the time the sun rose. Although the hotline failed to bring about a peaceful resolution of the incident, Wagner sources mentioned that the American forces were in constant contact with the official Russian liaison officer nearby and only returned fire when they had been assured that there were no troops from Russia's regular army nearby. The Pentagon later confirmed that these sources were credible. Cynically, one might view this piece of information as a preview of what would happen in Ukraine. Prigozhin often accused the regular Russian army of failing to adequately support his troops. They were instead cannon fodder. These accusations were partly an episode of politicking, particularly against Prigozhin's sworn enemy, Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu. Still, the Russians treated Wagner troops as expendable at Khasham, just like they later would in Ukraine. That comes with the territory of plausible deniability. When you're a problem, you're cast aside, with your home country gladly denying your existence if need be. The Battle of Khasham was one of the most lopsided defeats suffered by Russian fighters in recent history. It was so bad that the Wagner Group later called it Red February. Perhaps in an effort to lighten the psychological load, at least some survivors later received medals for their service at Khasham. The design of the medal shows a Russian soldier bravely standing up to an Apache helicopter and shooting at it. That never happened, of course, because none of the Russians on that field ever actually saw an Apache. Instead, the American helicopters saw them in the darkness from miles away and smoked them before they ever knew what hit them. The United States maintains control over the oil field and fortified it further in the battle's aftermath. The demonstration of American military might was a clear warning. A month later, Russian and Syrian forces again got close to the oil field. The Americans used the hotline to contact their Russian counterparts and warn them to withdraw. There were no objections this time. The entire force retreated from the area in short order. However, despite the overwhelming American victory, there is also a warning about this incident for the development of conflict in the future, one that the United States will need to heed. The Battle of Khasham was a good indicator that warfare is transitioning. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, and particularly the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the United States and its allies had trained to fight low-level counter-terror and counterinsurgency operations. The fight against ISIS was perhaps the peak of that approach to warfare. During those operations, American troops did not face the level of firepower they saw at the start of this episode. The troops at the Battle of Khasham were trained for just that occasion, which may have been why they were initially unprepared for the weapons that Wagner and the Syrians brought to the oil field. Instead, the incident on February 7th was an example of a return to state-based warfare, with its corresponding mass casualty events. In such events, each strike from the enemy can potentially leave dozens of casualties in its wake thanks to the use of much more powerful weapons. In contrast to the War on Terror, where small mortars, RPGs, or improvised explosive devices would be limited in scope, the troops fighting American forces at Khasham were using tanks, heavy artillery, and had air support on standby. Each shell or bomb came with the explosive power to kill or wound many American and SDF troops. The success in avoiding loss of life and limb during the Battle of Khasham came in large part because American diplomats convinced their Russian counterparts to shut down the SAM system that had been brought to the area. The diplomatic success ensured that the United States maintained the air dominance it had gotten used to during the War on Terror. However, had the SAM system been online, American air operations would have been made significantly more challenging to execute, and casualties likely would have increased dramatically. In a post-Ukraine invasion world, the Russians would not necessarily be so willing to shut down such a critical asset, even in an accidental confrontation. The rise of weapons that can undermine the ability of American aircraft to support their comrades fighting on the ground is why the RAND Corporation warned in a 2019 report that the United States urgently needed to rebuild its ground fire capabilities. RAND claimed that these skills had been allowed to atrophy following the end of the Cold War. Instead, the United States relied on fire support from its unchallenged ability to operate in the skies. This method of fire support was fine for the war on terror, where hostiles had no realistic chance of shooting down American aircraft. But against a peer or near-peer adversary using anti-access area denial weaponry, like the Russians could have had on hand at the Battle of Khasham, air support might not be so easy to get. Things would have been much less lopsided if the Russians were able to use their surface-to-air missiles, as would be the case in a true confrontation. In this regard, it's important that the American troops and their allies had ground-based fire support in the form of tubed artillery and HIMARS platforms. These systems can respond more rapidly to threats and are less vulnerable to anti-access area denial counters. In 2022, the Pentagon planned to have an arsenal of 900 HIMARS units. However, in May 2024, the United States Army ordered additional HIMARS worth $861.3 million. The following month, the Army increased its HIMARS order to $1.9 billion. The Army did not specify the reasons for this decision. Some of it may have been part of the latest aid package for Ukraine. However, most of it comes with the knowledge that the US Armed Forces must increase their ground fires capability. The United States also reinvested in the production of 155mm artillery ammunition. In December 2022, as the rate of artillery depletion in Ukraine became apparent, the US Army announced it would be seeking a dramatic expansion of shell production, with a planned 40,000 rounds per month by 2025. The shell hunger that Ukraine experienced in late 23 and early 24, and the resulting loss of territory as the Russian gunners outshot them, was another reminder of the importance of ground fires as part of an overall combined arms approach to warfare. In this regard, the Battle of Khasham might be seen as a marker at the end of one type of mission and the beginning of another. Although American firepower crushed the Wagner Group and its Syrian allies on February 7th, the operation showed the importance of a combined arms doctrine. Air and ground fires both played crucial roles which the war in Ukraine reconfirmed in their importance. Since the Gulf War of 1991, the United States military has rejoiced in its uncontested air support. This continued at the Battle of Khasham to devastating impact, but could it have been the last hurrah? What do you think about this incident? Would Russian surface-to-air missiles have made it less lopsided if they had been allowed to be used? What might this say about the return of state-based warfare and the resulting casualties one might expect in each confrontation? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out how the US completely overpowered Iraq in only 100 hours, or click this other video instead.